In the previous lesson, we set up a basic chatbot and a page that collects user information. But we encountered an issue where the chatbot did not recognize the information provided during the setup stage. In this lesson, we'll address this problem and enhance our chatbot to ensure it effectively utilizes user input. So, first, let's think about how we can solve this. We need to track whether the setup for the interview is complete. To do this, we can initialize a session state for the setup stage. We'll name it Setup Complete and initially set its value to false. This time, instead of directly changing the session state within a button, we'll create a cleaner version by defining a function to toggle the setup phase completion. Later, we'll attach this function to the button using an onClick event. This is an additional parameter that lets us specify a function that runs when the button is clicked. This allows us to trigger action, like updating the state, in a clear, organized way. Now, we must show the setup form only if the setup is incomplete. We do that by wrapping the whole setup form in an if statement that looks like this. This line checks if the setup complete session state variable is false. If it is, the form will be displayed, allowing the user to input their details. Once the setup is complete, and setup complete is set to true, the form will no longer be shown. Next, we must initialize session state variables for the user's personal information. This will allow us to keep track of the user's inputs across interactions and ensure the data is persistent throughout the session. Here's how we do that. For each piece of personal information, name, experience, and skills, we first check if a corresponding key exists in the session state. If the key does not exist, the session state for that variable hasn't been initialized. In this case, we create the key and set its default value to an empty string. Now that we have our variables, we'll update the personal information input fields to save their values directly into the session state, making the data available across interactions. We add st session state, followed by a set of square brackets, and pass the variable's name as a string. The same steps for the company and position information. First, we initialize session state variables for each input, and notice how we ensure each variable has a default value selected when the user starts the interview. This gives a starting point for each dropdown or selection input. Next, we again need to update the input fields to pull from the session state. In the previous version of the code, the selected values for level, position, and company were stored in regular variables. Now, we're integrating these fields with the session states we've just created. We rewrite the variables by adding st.sessionState, square brackets, and the name of the variable. We also set the index parameter to the session state. We apply this change to all variables to fully integrate the input fields with the session state. And finally, we need to add the button to complete the setup phase and trigger the session state update. Remember the onClick parameter that we mentioned earlier? It will call the complete setup function. This button will turn the setup complete session state to true, causing the setup form to disappear. This ensures the user completes the setup phase before moving on to the interview phase. We handled the transition similarly by checking if the setup complete session state is set to true. We then wrap our chatbot code inside this if statement. Now, let's move on to our chatbot. One thing we can do to make it more engaging is by adding an info box to guide the user, providing a friendly prompt to start the conversation. To do this, we'll introduce a new function, the info function. Here's how we use it. We write st.info, then the message we want to display. In our case, it will be, start by introducing yourself. We can also place an icon parameter, which allows us to add a visual element, such as an emoji. Before we wrap up this lesson, one last step is to connect the session state variables with the prompt. This ensures the chatbot can access the information collected in the setup phase. We achieve this by passing the session state variables into the prompt message. To reference a session state variable, we use the syntax st.sessionState square brackets followed by the variable name. This approach dynamically inserts the user-provided data into the prompt message. Let's test the interview to make sure everything works as intended. We'll start by filling out the setup fields with dummy data. For the name, let's enter Alex. In the experience field, we'll type 2 years of experience as a junior data scientist at Global Nets. Then, we'll complete the level, company, and position information. Once that's done, we click on Start Interview. Now, let's begin with the simple introduction. As you can see, the model recognizes our name and even remarks on our background, just like an actual interview. Great job, everyone! In the next lesson, we'll take the app to the next level by adding a feedback feature and making overall improvements to the project. See you then!